Welcome back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We're positively into football season around here. Going to be doing a Maryland Crab Cake Tour on Friday at Union Brewing. I got some great guests. The local Oyster's going to be with us. We're going to be there from 2 until 5. It's all brought to you by the Maryland Lottery. Let yourself play. Get on out. I'll have some Raven scratch-offs here sooner than later, as well as our friends at Window Nation and Goodwill Industries. And don't forget, it is the kickoff on Friday of Restaurant Week. Maryland Restaurant Week all over the state. Save some money. Go out and eat. Do what I did all of August. I don't know how I stayed this skinny, but I tell you what, go out and eat. Get fat next week. Order lunch, order dinner. All these restaurants showing off, including many of our sponsors as well. Luke Jones been showing off baseball, football, baseball. This is what happens when they don't let me in. He is covering all things Orioles, but was in the swamps of New Jersey on Sunday for all things Jets and Ravens. And I want to do baseball with you. I saw a great piece about the rule changes and the clock and the bases being bigger and the shift. And that's all for next year. But, you know, the real shift is it's been a couple days since we talked some baseball. You've been off with football and baseball team. This is it's getting a little more dire, a little more urgent. I mean, it was fun while it lasted, but they got to win a lot of games right now.
Yeah, and it's really, for me, a matter of Seattle, Toronto, and Tampa Bay have just been so good. When you're talking about a scenario, even going back 2 months ago, when we were talking about this, they had the long winning streak in early July, All-Star break. This wild card race and somehow have a chance to do it. The scenario was always going to be, well, what was the number going to be? 86 wins, 87 wins, maybe 88 wins. Well, you look at Seattle, Toronto, and Tampa Bay, and they're all up in there in the 90, 91, 92 win range. And I just think for the Orioles, I think they're just running out of gas a little bit. I mean,
that's
we've
a
talked
high
about it
mountain.
with the bullpen.
If we would have said April 1st, 92 wins, you'd have said, ain't no way.
Yeah, well, of course. I mean, I felt like I was being overly optimistic just saying they weren't going to lose 100. So, I mean, that's, again, where you keep going back to where expectations were, how this team has exceeded them. But realistically speaking, with where they are, the fact that they haven't swung the bats very well, the fact that the bullpen has been asked to do so much, including Felix Bautista, who we've seen deal with a little bit of arm fatigue here of late, the starting pitching overachieving, but clearly looking at that group and not seeing guys that you can consistently count on to go deep into games. And you just look at this thing and you just say, how much can you really expect? So it's disappointing, the fact that, you know, we're now into mid-September and you're 5 games out of that third wild card spot, and that does look pretty dire just looking at it mathematically. But
last week against
it really
Toronto,
is a case
that was sort of a mess for them, right? I mean, when you look back at it, they had to play exceedingly well. They did not, and they have more chances though. That's the other part of this, is that I know when we went to Harnish and Malachy and Dave Johnson and the Nail and all that, they had to win the whole weekend to win, right? Like, you know, let's at some point, if you're within 3 and you got 4 to play against them, you can do this, right? So let's not write that part of it off, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not mathematically over, but when you look at it practically speaking, how these teams have played, how the Orioles have played, which, you know, remember, they got to 10 games above 500 since that in that Oakland series. They lost that Sunday, and then Labor Day. I mean, that's the day we're going to go point back to. I mean, you just mentioned it, Labor Day. Jordan Lyles is supposed to pitch one of those 2 games in the doubleheader. He's been your workhorse. He's that one guy in that rotation in terms of you count on to go deep into games. And he wakes up under the weather and he can't pitch. And that's the day of a doubleheader. That's going to be tough for any team, let alone a team that, let's face it, has overachieved with its pitching. So, I mean, that's really the day we're going to point back to and look, assuming the Orioles don't make a miracle run here over the last couple of weeks of the season. We're going to look at that. But your point is well taken. I mean, 2 games with the Nationals this week, and then you go to Rogers Center. The Toronto comes in for the
well, I would say for them playing well in Toronto this weekend could resuscitate. Dude, we could be here Monday and the Ravens could lose to the Dolphins and be 1-1, and the Ravens could be a half game, or the Orioles could be a half game out of the wild card. I mean, that's possible. And this is a team. Look, you're the nice guy here. Don't make me play the role of defender of the Orioles on this, okay? But they had lost 3 games in a row in 3.5 months. I mean, like this last week, whether you want to call it a mirage, whatever it is, the leveling of their talent and their ability and where they are. But I I don't know, dude. This has been one of those patients when you're going to call them dead. That worries me a little bit, especially when the life would be that they could go to Toronto and play well.
Sure, sure. I mean, let's face it. If this team's going to do it, and I'm not saying they can't do it, I'm just saying it's looking bleak. And you just look at the fact that those other teams, I mean, you just look at the standings and Seattle going into Tuesday's play, 18 above 500, Toronto 18 over, Tampa Bay 17 over, and that's even after the Rays scuffled a little bit over the weekend. That's a really tall mountain to climb at this point. And I just think with the Orioles, they've got to, if they have another, I don't think it needs to be a 10-game winning streak like we saw in early July, but if they can reel off 7 of 8, 8 of 9, something along those lines,
but
and
it's
yeah,
always going to take that. You're not going to go 4 and 6 and stumble into the playoffs, especially now with this many teams, involved in this thing.
I generally agree with you, but to me, that's actually, I would actually say the opposite. When you have 3 wild cards as opposed to 1 for as long as it was, or then 2, there's another lesser team that's going to make the field, right? I mean, that was kind of the argument against expanding the playoffs, right? In terms of people saying, well, now owners have less incentive to spend because they're allowing another team into the field. So, yeah, that's a big picture discussion, certainly. But yeah, I mean, they can still do it. I'm not saying it's over. I'm just saying that it's getting really, really difficult when you're talking about teams that are starting to get closer and closer to being 20 games above 500. I just think you look at the Orioles and, I mean, it's with 22 games to play, they've kind of been in that 6, 7, 8, 9, and their high water mark was 10 games above 500, but they've lost 6 of 8 since then.
22 games, they need to win 15 of them, 16 of them. That's the truth, and that's still
not enough. Yeah. I mean, if you do that, then yeah, we are going to. I guess it's not a weekend. I guess it's a weekday.
But my point is, when you're the stalker, you got to play 700 baseball to be thinking about catching up. That's all. I mean, look, these are great conversations to be having in September,
of course,
right? I mean, like I don't even magic numbers and stuff that we ain't ever heard around here, right? But I would also say I wouldn't give up on them just yet. And I think all of the caliber we talked about, the young players that were, dude, back in April and May, we're like, is Rutschman going to get here? He might be the MVP, right? I mean, are these guys these guys are here now. This is their chance to go into Toronto this weekend and have some fun. This is their playoff this weekend, right? I mean, literally.
Yeah,
every game's a playoff game right now for them.
No question about it.
That's good seasoning for these young guys.
And that was, you just took the words right out of my mouth. I think for me, and I've said this all along, even going back to the trade deadline when we were talking about will they or won't they trade Mancini? Will they trade Santander? Will they trade Jorge Lopez? Jordan Lyles? Go down the list of guys that we were talking about at that point. And my motivation as far as excitement for this team has always been 2023, really starting next year. This has been the cherry on top that they've been able to do this. Not to say that you take it for granted or that you give up or that you don't want them to make it. But for me, the excitement was always that Adley Rutschman's going to get to play in a wild card race. Gunnar Henderson, who's been up for a couple weeks now, is getting to play in a playoff race. And all those growing pains, speed bumps, however you want to characterize a rookie adjusting to life in the majors, I'd much rather see them up and taking some of those licks, taking some of those bumps right now, because that's just going to make them that much better for 2023. And that's why I'm so intrigued by this offseason and seeing what Mike Elias is going to do, seeing what the payroll might go to. And that's not to say it's going to be insane. I don't think we're going to see a lucrative payroll bump, but we'll certainly see a bump because it can't go much lower than it's been the last couple of years. So what does that look like? What does the trade market look like for them now in terms of not necessarily saying, well, you're going to trade someone because they're too expensive, but can you trade from a strength to go out and acquire the top half of the rotation starting pitcher? So we'll talk about that. There will be plenty of time for that discussion because for the first time in a long time, the offseason is going to be interesting, right? With what they're doing or what they're not doing. It's not going to just be this, well, we don't talk about it for 3 months and then come January 15th, they start making some of their minor league signings, which is what they've done the last few years. It's going to be a real offseason to some degree. So
biggest issue for them is going to be if they're going to spend money and sign a pitcher or not, or two. Right?
Sure. Well, but it's not just pitching or it's not just signing a pitcher. The trade market, is there a case where We've seen the Orioles be in this position. We know other teams do this as well. Is there going to be an arbitration eligible bat or a starting pitcher out there that maybe you trade from some of your assets in the farm system to go get a guy like that because you say, yeah, we have the ability to increase the payroll at this point, or Mike Elias has gotten the blessing to do that, let's say. So yeah, I mean, there are going to be a lot of possibilities with that. So for me, these last few weeks of the season are still about not just holding on to whatever playoff hope you have at this point, which is still there, even if it's not looking as favorable as it did 2 weeks ago. But it's also evaluating. You're still in this mode of looking at what you need. I mean, for as much as we talk about the position player excitement, went with Rutschman, with Gunnar Henderson, Kyle Stowers coming up, some of these other guys. I mean, Santander taking the step forward he did, even being a little bit older, but drawing walks now and making himself more valuable at the plate. For me, I still look at this thing and say, I think there's still another bat out there to acquire. If we're being honest and looking at this thing, I think it would be a mistake to just look at it in terms of looking at the young guys. I think they can add there, certainly the starting pitching, but this is all about evaluating. And part of that for me down the stretch here, even if let's say, they continue to stumble just enough where it's obvious that they're 6 or 7 out with 2 weeks to play, where you're just going to say it's not going to happen, realistically speaking. That for me is where I want to see these young guys play. I'm intrigued to see DL Hall pitch the rest of the year. I'm very much interested in seeing Grayson Rodriguez, who is going to be making a couple more starts at AAA. Do you pull the trigger to give him an outing or two in Baltimore before the season's over? It doesn't look like it's necessarily going to be in a playoff race, but even if you're out of it, isn't there some value to doing that for him if you feel he's healthy and ready to do it? So there's still plenty to watch. And even if we're talking about this thing being bleak from a wild card perspective, this is still a really interesting team to watch, knowing what this offseason is going to mean, knowing what the expectations are going to be next year. I mean, I've said all along, even before they racked off 10 wins in a row in early July, I thought this coming off season was going to be critical. I thought this offseason was going to be the time where you fully turn up the dial and say, all right, we're not really talking about development anymore. Yeah, that goes on down below in the farm system, but we're talking about maximizing major league wins. That time is now. So everything you do between now and the end of the season, certainly you're not giving up. And like we said, if they can beat Toronto 5 out of 6 or whatever, the head-to-head series remains, it is a case of seeing what you have and seeing what these guys can do and trying to figure out what it's going to look like next year. And, some of that could involve trading, some of these guys that we've known here recently. I mean, I would think the Orioles, you look at someone like Austin Hayes, who great first half, right? I mean, we were talking about him being most valuable Oriole through the first 3 months of the season. Second half's been largely a disaster for him. Can you get him on a roll to finish up his season well? And
well, think of what you would have gotten for Cedric Mullins this time last year. I'm not saying that they were going to do that, or, but that is baseball for these guys in the Billy Beane world. Is where is your value now? Where is your value tomorrow? And what's your salary going to be tomorrow? And like that's where all of this is, and saying, well, we like the guy, we like the player, but we can do better than that, or we have a guy on the farm that's going to make minimum. Let's go play with him, and that's. The Orioles are going to play this woe is me, we're a small market, we don't have any money game, because that's what they played themselves into over my 30 years, right? I mean, that's what they are at this point. They are Billy Ball at this. They're not going $220 million payroll. There is no more Masson anymore. The kids have taken all the money and done whatever the hell they've done with it, right? So the notion that this is going to be a rich team the way it was in 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, they had a few years where they had money, and even Chris Davis, getting a piece of that and all of that. They spent some money around here, a period of time. And they're not going to spend like that again. I don't believe they are. I don't believe they're going to have the wherewithal to do that, given local market and the things that I cover. When I talk to owners and I talk to them about money and business and what the market will bear for the Orioles locally. Now, you can talk about MLB and BAM and and certainly with the Ravens, I mean, I'm watching Troy Aikman and Joe Buck games are on Amazon. I mean, Lamar's going to get $60 million before it's all over with, because that's just the money's getting crazy. Baseball, money's not going like that. I mean, Forbes had the Orioles as a depreciating asset last year. I mean, so wherever they are, it's not they're going to go get Scherzer and whomever, right? I mean, they're not getting $30 million pitchers, but I am interested to see what they think they are as a business? What do they think their payroll will be? What do they project ticket sales? And whatever sponsors they're going to go out here and get that the Ravens haven't already swept up. I mean, Dick Cass would say to me many times, we're not in a Fortune 500 city here. We don't have Fortune 500 companies here. We don't have big ticket companies here. We don't have skybox holders, suite holders, sponsors, all of these issues. The Orioles have run their business like a tent for 20 years. And now they may have something. Who's going to fork over $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 for sponsorships? Where are the season ticket holders coming and what will they pay? Where's the revenue? I mean, literally for them, because this is part of this. They're going to spend money and they're going to expect revenue to some degree if they have anybody running the business there, TJ Brightman. And this is really where the business hat comes on and says, what do we think we are as a revenue model? What can we really afford to spend? How much is too much? Because too much is too much. We have to trade Cedric Mullins. Not we want to. We're just not going to pay him $24 million to play in 2025. We know that. In the same way the Ravens looked at Orlando Brown and just said, we're not going to pay him. We got to do something else. Hollywood Brown, we're not going to pay him. We got to do something else. So there is a little bit of that baked into how the Ravens operate, if you're familiar. But baseball being a little bit more of the wild, wild west without the salary cap and wildly disparate payrolls, right? This is a time for them to figure out what they are. That's what I'm trying to. What are you?
Yeah, that's fair. And I think a big key there is you have to spend wisely, right? I mean, you need to use your resources well. I mean, a big criticism of the Orioles in the Peter Angelos era was those periods of time where they did spend money. They spent it very poorly. They spent it on the wrong players. You spend it. I mean, starting with Chris Davis, but there are
I could give you
number of guys.
$500 million of our money, your money, my money, the cable money, wherever they get their money, that went into the hands of 6 or 8 human beings, like whether it's David Segui, Chris Davis. I mean, they didn't give Jay Gibbons that much money, but all these people they brought back. But I just Rafael Palmeiro, there's $35 million, money that just went out the door in hundreds of millions of dollars. And then you look back and you see empty seats and you see empty suites and you say, what was the investment? Was the investment in 79 wins or whatever, happened that year? But the actual investment in things like Cal Ripken, in the way that they could have given Adam Jones a couple of $1 million a couple of years ago, and they'd have a valet and a spokesperson and a cool guy and a color commentator and an advocate and an RBI. They would have had all of that, but they've just mismanaged not just the payroll, even the things you would talk about on the baseball side to say they didn't have an academy. They're giving Chris Davis $150 million and they don't have $10 million for an academy, right? So like these little things that really go into the strategy of who's running your business. And Moeller and I get sideways on this if he ever comes back on after the Chad Steele missive, but we get sideways on who's running their business. And they have brothers fighting and a mother overseeing it. And this is the most important time for their business, to reconnect and get me and my wife out to the game, to try to figure out a way to get your sister and her husband and your niece out to Orioles games 4 times next year on Sundays and have her run the bases and take pictures and get her an Oriole hat and feel like it's worth the value for driving down from Pennsylvania into the city. Like this is, they got shit going on like Tom Brady, and I'm going to be working now that Chad's thrown me out. I have time on my hands. I'm going to be holding them accountable. I'm letting everybody know, like they want to grow. They want to sell tickets. What are you doing? What's your winter carnival look like? You doing any caravanning? You going out and speaking to groups? Where are the Ravens talking to Ravens Roost and stuff like that? I mean, we've lost that in this community over 30 years when this company began, as far as what a grassroots community effort, which is everything Boog Powell and Brooks Robinson were. It was everything that Johnny Unitas and Artie Donovan was. Honestly, it was everything that David Modell and Vinny Testaverde and Ray Lewis kind of started here, and Tony Saragusa coming over to the barn. I want to see, because the Orioles have turned the lights out when the season ends every year around here, right? And they just go away. And the Ravens are happy to have that happen. And, those games in October, November, December, the Orioles aren't signing anybody. Things aren't moving. There is no more newspaper you open every day and you get above the fold to get attention. The attention only comes from your own fan base getting excited about things on social media or whatever. That's it. And the Ravens understand that. The Ravens get Poe breaks a leg and they're doing commercials. They're using Joe Ortiz's scouting time to make blooper videos. You know what I mean? Like they're doing Hard Knocks all day long in Owings Mills. One of the reasons I got thrown out. So the Orioles, what are they going to do in the offseason to stimulate business? And you want to make the baseball team better. I hear that. But I think that there's all sorts of things going on here when the lights go out, October, November, December, January, to say we're something again. And we want you to come back out to the ballpark and be a part of this. And we're going to make it exciting again. And we're going to sell it. We're going to front face and we're going to get out and hustle. I don't know. I don't think any of that's going to happen, by the way. But in my mind, a new ownership would have all of that. And whenever the new ownership happens, there will be a different pep in the step. And they'll want people like me trying to get people to go to Sarasota. I mean, like selling the drama, selling the enthusiasm for the team and for baseball. And baseball's got huge changes coming next year, right? Like if you go back to the ballpark next year, you're going to see sort of a different kind of game in a big way, right?
Yeah. I mean, as much as pitch clock and anti-shift and the bigger bases, I mean, I don't think it's going to be a completely different game, but certainly going to be some changes there for the more astute fan who pays closer attention on a nightly basis. But to go back to your point, I mean, I don't disagree with what you're saying. I mean, but they're finally in a position now, and when I say they, I mean the Orioles since 2018, right? Since they made the changes and Mike Elias coming in. Dan Duquette and Buck Showalter go away. This is the first time now they'll have an off season where, people are going to be paying attention because it's relevant and they want to know because of a team that won 84 games or 85 games or however many wins the Orioles finish with. It's a case of now, how do you augment that? We know a lot of that's going to be internal.
Capability. There's no perception anymore. It's a reality. They are capable of making the playoffs.
Sure, no question about it, especially when you look at how little they did from an off-season standpoint last year when Jordan Lyles and Rougned Odor were your big additions, right? And Robinson Chirinos. So it is a case of, again,
and they've all contributed.
Sure, and I'm with you. We're not going to see lucrative payroll increase, but we'll see some increase, whatever it is, and we'll see all these young guys being a year older, and we'll see what Mike Elias does on the trade front, which I think is going to be a big part of what they do over the next several years, because it was in Houston. Houston acquired Justin Verlander. They acquired Garrett Cole at one point. I mean, you look at some of the trades that they made, and we've talked about their starting pitching depth in their system not being as deep as the position side. So, but going back to some of what you said, there are going to be limitations in terms of what they spend as far as this market and how ownership proceeds. That is why it's going to be imperative that they spend wisely, that they look at each addition or each signing that they're going to have, each contract that they give out. It's going to be, okay, how much are we spending? And really the best teams that do this, and Eric DaCosta would tell you this on the football side, when you're talking about dollars, and you're talking about picks and all those resources you have to theoretically get better, you're not thinking about it in terms of players as much as value, in terms of wins. That was the whole gist of Moneyball. It was, how much is a win? How much money can we take to add wins to this ball club? And there are a variety of ways to do it. The A's decided 20 plus years ago that they couldn't afford Jason Giambi, but they went out there and they got Scott Hatteberg, and they realized that a couple guys with their on-base capability could make up some of what you lost. And the idea that you look at imperfect assets, but you look at the strengths rather than just the weaknesses. There's all of that, and the Orioles will do that because a lot of these analytically minded franchises will do that. But it still comes down to you need to make smart decisions. As we said, there were plenty of periods of time in the Peter Angelos era where the Orioles did spend money, and they didn't spend it well. They spent it foolishly more often than not. From Chris Davis to Ubaldo Jimenez and some of the names that you mentioned in previous eras. So it really is a case of identifying what you have at the major league level right now, identifying what you have at AAA. I mentioned Austin Hayes, and then we kind of went off track there. Let's say Austin Hayes gets back on track and rakes over these last 2.5 weeks of the season, finishes with better final numbers. You look at his overall numbers and they're solid, but you look at the Orioles and you say, okay, Colton Cowser's at AAA right now. He's going to be in the majors next year. And we project him to be better than Austin Hayes, which I think would be a fair assessment. I think Mike Elias wouldn't say that publicly, but he would say certainly. He's not going to be disparaging the guys they have at the major league level right now, but they have assets at AAA and AA that are coming and more talented players. We talked about this with Rutschman and Gunnar Henderson. They look a little bit different. It feels a little bit different with them. They're dudes rather than just solid to good players like they've had the last couple years that have kind of led this, this year's resurgence. But you're going to make decisions, and yeah, at face value, some of those will look financially motivated. But if it's a case of you have a guy that's approaching arbitration, but you have someone at AAA that you project to be better than that guy, well, why wouldn't you move on from that guy? You're going to trade the more expensive guy, bring in another asset that's going to help you, and then you promote from within. So there's going to be a lot of that going on. I mean, my goodness, the whole idea of rebuilding and a talent pipeline and tanking and 1-1 picks and all of that, that's going to be the foundation for what they do. In the same way we talk about the Ravens with the draft every year. Yes, they're going to need to augment. And what you said is completely valid in terms of paying attention to what's going to happen now and how they market the team and how they drum up business, because that's going to have an impact directly or indirectly on what payroll is going to look like in the coming years. But it still comes back to having a base of talent, which we're seeing, and it's arriving. More guys are on the way. And then with the money that you have available to spend on free agents or trade acquisitions, Mike Elias and the scouts in the front office and Sig Mejdal, everyone, they need to make wise decisions because there are great additions to be made every year, and you want to make those decisions. You don't want to be throwing money around for a guy that then you find out, a season later that you have someone that's better than him. I mean, look at Trey Mancini with Chris Davis, right? We think of Chris Davis when he was signed post 2015. Orioles give him a 7-year deal. Trey Mancini was up in the major leagues at the end of that next season. If the Orioles had identified that a little bit better, and really we know that was a Peter move. Dan Duquette didn't want that. Wasn't Dan Duquette who signed Chris Davis. I think anyone who's paid attention knows that. But there was a perfect example of money that was spent so foolishly compared to replacing from within and then reallocating those assets. And yeah, it wouldn't have been 161 million spent on another player, but it could have been some of that, at least a fraction of that, spent on 2 or 3 other players that, who knows, may have helped the Orioles win and do more than they did in 2016, for example. So it's just an example. It's water under the bridge at this point, but that's why I'm so fascinated to see where the Orioles go from here, while acknowledging and remembering it's been really fun this year. As you said, the fact that you and I in mid-September are having a very serious conversation about the Orioles, not just whatever their wild card chances are at this point, which aren't looking very good, but moving forward now and trying to figure out what exactly they're going to do to get over the hump next year and be a team that is contending for the division, is not just looking to be the third wild card, but to be the second or third best team in the AL, let's say. I mean, all those goals should be there at this point. As Mike Elias said famously several weeks back, it's liftoff at this point. So yeah, they're going to be under the microscope to see what they do this offseason to get themselves to that next level.
All right, Luke Jones and I are doing baseball right now, strangely enough. We'll get back to football. Anything you want to say football-wise, just off the presser on Monday you attended, just to sneak that in, because I do want to go back to baseball and the weird rule changes, just while we're talking some baseball, because I have a feeling you are going to be talking a lot of football here the next couple months.
Oh, no question about it. The unfortunate news, and we had talked about this in our previous conversation as far as the post-game fallout, but Kyle Fuller, Mount St. Joe product, Baltimore native, good story coming back. Unfortunately, in the last couple of minutes on Sunday, we all saw him go down. It didn't look good. John Harbaugh had said in the post-game that, maybe they had some reason for hope, but unfortunately, the MRI revealed a torn ACL for Kyle Fuller. So we say it every year, Nestor. It's amazing. We talk about the secondary and how deep it is going into the season. And I always go back to what Ozzie Newsome said several years back. You can never have enough corners. And, well, sure enough, you hope Marcus Peters is back this week. He's close. But they lose a key depth piece, Kyle Fuller, who I thought played pretty well on Sunday as well, but unfortunately he's lost for the season. And again, a tough break, a Baltimore kid, doesn't even get to play a home game. I mean, just think about that. That's a total bummer for him. And it's a bummer for the Ravens secondary depth, but year in, year out, feels like no matter how deep the secondary is, we're, at some point later this season, we'll be talking about them being thin at corner. That's just, it's just that kind of position where injuries seem to happen very frequently.
By the way, I just want to say something about local kids because I grew up as a local kid here on the east side. And when Cal Ripken or Tim Norris were making it, or when Brian Jordan was making it in two sports, and he was more of a contemporary of mine over at Milford Mill. When local kids make it, and they make it, whether the little punt returner from out in Frederick, Mike, began with a C. Give me his last name. Come on,
Michael Campanaro.
Campanaro. There you go. Laquan, who I ran into in the hospital. My wife was battling a number of years ago in town. Tori's still hanging around, but didn't grow up here. But, there is something about the local kids and him playing here. Foxworth, being another example of a guy that came back and played. But we haven't had many. You know what I mean? Over all these years, it's like when an Oriole local kid like Zimmerman pitches for the Orioles, or Dave Johnson, or, whatever. There's just something really, really neat about that sort of ties things together in well, every time I see Dave Johnson, I think, oh, maybe I could have done that. You know what I mean? Because that's the part of Kyle Fuller, I think, that I've seen change here over the last 20 years, kids playing football here and making it to the NFL.
No question about it. I mean, it's been really fun in that way. When you think about, like people my age, right? I mean, the Ravens I was 13 when the Ravens arrived in Baltimore and played, I was a month shy of my 13th birthday when they played their first game against the Oakland Raiders on 33rd Street. And, you just think about that generation where, yeah, I mean, it's not as though there wasn't football in Baltimore and Maryland and the greater area, but you didn't have the mojo for it in the same way. I mean, with apologies to the Stallions or the Baltimore Stars, or over that 13-year period, it just wasn't the same. So for the Ravens and young players who've come to Baltimore, even guys who haven't played here but spoke about the influence the Ravens had on them, that's cool. So again, it's a bummer for Kyle Fuller. It's a bummer for the Ravens from a secondary depth standpoint, but it's part of the game. And I know some people will continue to hammer the strength and conditioning staff and the trainers and all of that, but look around the league. I keep saying this. Yes, there are best practices that you always want to tweak and training methods and different things you can do there. And you should always be doing that internal evaluation. But the only way you're taking injuries out of football is you're taking the football out of football, right? I mean, you're just not playing. Right? Injuries are part of the game. And we saw that around the league. And week one, plenty of good players going down either with season-ending injuries or season-altering injuries. So it's unfortunate, losing Jawan James and Kyle Fuller. The good news, the optimism, the hope that you have, unlike last year, is Ronnie Stanley and Marcus Peters coming back. Now, what they look like still remains to be seen, but this is a different position that they're in now as opposed to post-week one last year where those guys were gone and they weren't coming back and you were just kind of in survival mode already. So, the Ravens move on and we'll see. It's next man up. And I anticipate that being Brandon Stevens, who, by the way, played pretty well on Sunday. Thought he did a nice job making some plays on the ball. So this will be a greater opportunity for him, even if Marcus Peters makes his season debut against Miami on Sunday.
When we talk about draft picks stepping up, Stevens is one of those guys that they've been sort of grooming in that Ladarius Webb sort of way to be that guy. Luke can be found at Baltimore and Luke at WNST.net. All right, back to baseball. One last thing. I read this piece, got sent over to me by Mike Fleischauer, who is always a deep reader. And he works blue on the internet too, so I appreciate that, Mike. Thank you. Bases being made bigger. I'm like, why? And it says, because guys' feet are big and the game hadn't changed in 100 years and there's not enough bag for feet and it makes it easier for judgment and all that. I'm like, oh, okay, that's smart. Okay, I wonder why they didn't do that before. I didn't know that was a big controversy for years. Back in my day, we never talked about the size of the bags being a problem, but I noticed that was the first footnote. Then there's the shift, which is pretty obvious how that's changed the numbers of the game and probability and all the math nerds like Sig Mejdal. And then there's the pitch clock, which is these games are 4.5 hours long, especially when they start playing 13 to 11 and you get into bullpen games and all night and TVs and like all of that. Baseball games ending at 1:30 in the morning, World Series games ending at 1:30 in the morning, all that sort of thing. I get it, but I do think it's going to change dramatically for a guy like me to go out there April 16th next year and watch them play the Brewers or whatever and sit there and watch a pitch clock. Because it is, I know the minors have been in on it and whatever. I haven't spent time with it. It's unfamiliar to me. Kind of like the 3-point play was when my dad came online back in the 80s, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it is one of those things that, yeah, if you're watching it consciously, I think it'll be different. At the same time, it's not as though the pitch clock is just right there on the mound and it's visibly jarring that it's there. It's not quite like that. I don't think we're going to see fans counting down, for example, in the same way that
Well,
the
what
shot
happens
clock.
if you miss the pitch clock? It's a ball, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
it's an automatic
But
ball. Okay.
and there'll be some of that early on, but I think what you'll see a rapid adjustment there. I don't think this is going to be. First of all, I'm not sure that these things are really going to make the game that much better. I still think a big problem is the velocity in the game and the way the game is played in that way. You know, you and I have talked about some of these proposed rule changes over the years, and I still very much think that if you really wanted to fundamentally change what we're seeing now, I would much more be exploring, and I know you wouldn't do it overnight, but I would be exploring moving the mound back, you know, whether it's 6 inches, whether it's a foot, you know, somewhere in that neighborhood, because I think, you know, we talk about it all the time. The number of pitchers on each staff that throw 97, 98, 99, triple digits. I mean, I still think that's a big part of it. You know, the shift, I go back and forth on this. There is a part of me that's really bothered by the stifling of intellectual effort that goes into this, you know, in terms of, you know, this is all based on batted ball data. And so we're just going to reward guys like Chris Davis who can't go the other way. You know, we're just going to reward that now. Is that what we're saying? Is it really going to make offense better? I don't know. You know, I want to see what it looks like. So, you know, pitch clock, I think it's helped with pace in the minor leagues. I think it'll help with pace. Be interesting to see if there's some gamesmanship that goes on with that, quite frankly, with between pitcher and batter. So, you know, and between the bases, you mentioned, you know, just one other thought on that. The distance between first and second and between second and third will now be a little bit shorter. Does that increase base stealing a little bit? Does that increase the likelihood of, you know, a few more extra base hits here and there? Maybe. You know, so we'll see. Again, I don't know if any of this is drastically changing the game, but I am looking forward to seeing how it turns out. And I'll say this much, even if I'm not all hot and bothered by these rules or thinking they're going to be this great change, I'm also not thinking it's going to ruin the game either. So exhale, it'll be okay. And it'll still mostly look like the game that we all love, or the game that some people don't love as much, which is part of why we're talking about rule changes like this.
Well, even if the Orioles don't make the playoffs this year, they will be contenders next year. They will be perceived to be as such. We had a lot to talk about around here. Orioles, Ravens, getting back after it on the Maryland Crab Cake Tour on Friday. We'll be over at Union Brewing. Big thanks to the lottery, as well as our friends at Window Nation Goodwill. And don't forget, Restaurant Week starting this week. Get out, eat, enjoy yourself, tip well, overindulge. The kids are back at school. I'm Nestor. We are WNST, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore. We never stop talking Baltimore. Positive.